Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, joined by co-hosts William Albrecht and Eric Ibarra. We have esteemed guest, Professor Dr. Aaron Canty. How are you? It's good to have you on the show.
I'm great. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. And what we're doing today is we're talking about Professor Canty's book, which is available on Amazon.com. I'm also going to put a link to it in the description by the time this publishes on YouTube. But it's called Light and Glory: The Transfiguration of Christ and Early Franciscan and Dominican Theology. So this is going to be very interesting because usually when we talk about the light, it's usually in the context of Gregory Palamas, and you usually don't hear a whole lot about the Franciscan and the Dominican perspective on this topic. So let me just kind of dive right in and ask, overall, what exactly is the thrust of this book? What is the light in the Franciscan and the Dominican perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think especially if one comes from the topic, from the perspective of Gregory Palamas, one's going to be a little bewildered by what one finds here. If one's coming at it from the perspective of the essence energies distinction, or if one's thinking about it as really the light is the theotes, the divinity, but there's really nothing else going on, or at least there's no emphasis on the visibility or the visible manifestations of what's going on, which isn't entirely the case in Byzantine exegesis in general, but it's very different. So maybe, and I know my book was actually criticized for not engaging Palamas very much, and one of the reasons why I didn't on purpose is because they're just two different thought worlds and coming
Right.
from two different vocabularies, two different thought worlds. Um, there's a great book I can mention right now. It's a series of translations by Father Brian Daly. You might be familiar with it, Light on the Mountain, which has roughly 23 homilies. I think this was published, it's St. Vladimir Seminary Press, 2013. And it's like 300 pages of patristic Byzantine exegesis on the Transfiguration. And a lot of it, it's very beautiful, but it's by no means unanimous. I mean, there are certain emphases, obviously, but not every homily is the same or commentary is the same. But just transitioning back to the Western tradition for a little bit, what I was really interested in is the theology of medieval cathedral schools and universities. And for the most part, there aren't a whole lot of sermons from most of these scholars that are available. So what you have really are commentaries on Peter Lombard's sentences or Sume or things like that. And quite honestly, there's practically nothing about the mysteries of Christ's life. You read Q of St. Victor, for example, De Sacramentis, there's not a whole lot. Peter Lombard, there's not a whole lot. Usually they go from incarnation to passion, death, and resurrection and kind of skip over Jesus' earthly ministry. And there are a number of probably legitimate reasons to do so, even when you consider how they decide to structure their books. So what I found interesting is, well, there are some places in the 13th century where people are exploring certain aspects of Christ's life, sometimes in disputed questions or quodlibetical questions, sometimes in scriptural commentaries, many of which are unedited. Um, in my book, I looked at Alexander of Hales, for example, John of La Rochelle. Their scriptural commentaries haven't been edited. So I kind of wanted to explore the history of medieval exegesis and to integrate it with what's generally known, the more published works and edited works, the systematic works, the so-called systematic works. And you do see that in Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, where there are the mysteries of Christ's life, what Thomas calls the second part of the third part of the Summa, where he talks about how questions 26 or 27 through 59 are going to be about those things that Christ did and suffered in his flesh. And you get this brief set of questions 40 to 45, on the life and ministry of Jesus, which is very unusual in the history of scholastic theology, actually.
By the way, you mentioned Alexander of Hales there. I've read his commentary on, I want to say it was First and Second Thessalonians. That's been translated, but what other commentary were you referencing there? What did he right on? Was it the
Oh,
Gospel of John or
so synoptics. So I mean,
the
so with the
Synoptics? Yeah,
Transfiguration narratives, I didn't really
yeah,
look at Second Peter, although that would
yeah.
be interesting. But I just focused on the synoptics.
On the Gospels. I
So
gotcha.
so it's Alexander. So in my book, at least, Alexander Hales, John of La Rochelle, the Catena Aurea of Thomas Aquinas,
Right,
Bonaventure,
right.
and Hugh of Saint-Cher,
Hmm.
the Dominican.
Did you touch on the Glossa Ordinaria any, or was there not really anything to contribute there?
I kind of wanted to focus on the period between roughly 1225 and 1275, because that was the
Right.
period in which these mysteries of Christ's life were treated in the medieval universities in a kind of synthetic way. The Glossa Ordinaria comes up either implicitly or explicitly in the commentary of Hugh of Saint-Cher, which was put together by his kind of grad students, so to speak, in roughly like the late
Yeah.
1230s. And then also Thomas Aquinas makes some references to the Glossa Ordinaria in the Summa.
Right. Right. Yeah. Good. Well, I mean, can you tell us exactly what is the light from what you've researched? Of course, the way I understand it in the Palamite tradition, this is actually divine, whereas in the Franciscan and Dominican tradition, is it something else?
It is something else. They're totally fine talking about the divinity. In fact, actually, it's question 45, Article 4 of the third part of the Summa, where Thomas talks about what's being revealed is the begetting of the Son of God. So I mean that's not that dissimilar from Gregory Palamas. I'm focusing on one of the Trinitarian relations, but that's not the
Hmm.
starting point for the scholastic theologians when they're asking the question, what is transfiguration and what is it all about? Really, and this is not atypical for scholastic theology, it starts really with a definition. What is transfiguratio? I mean, it's almost like etymological. Let's get that down to the basics. What does it mean? Does it mean like Satan can take on different forms? Is that what was going on? Like, did Jesus take on a different bodily form? Was he putting off his humanity? Was there something? John of La Rochelle asks the question about, was the light in the air and not in his body? Oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. So they
Hmm.
ask a whole bunch of interesting questions. And it kind of starts with the basic definition of what is transfiguration. Eventually, Thomas will say simply that it's the assumption of clarity. And see, that's not something that the Eastern tradition really deals with. What is claritas? In fact, actually, the Western patristic tradition doesn't deal with that. I mean, Thomas Aquinas will say in one of his responses that Augustine says in a letter to Dioscorus that the glory of the body comes from a beatified soul. But the fact of the matter is, Augustine never uses the phrase claritas as a kind of gift of glorified bodies. So I think what's a little bewildering, especially if you're coming at it from a patristic perspective, is that it uses some vocabulary and framework that the early church fathers don't use. And so you do get the vocabulary of dotes, or gifts of glorified bodies, which doesn't come up in the fathers. At least that vocabulary doesn't come up in the fathers. They will talk about, obviously, what are resurrected bodies, what are the qualities of resurrected bodies, especially City of God. Towards the end of the City of God, Augustine talks about that. But the early church fathers don't use the language of dotes to talk about the qualities of glorified bodies. So getting back to your question, what are they thinking about as far as the light? They're thinking about, how is this related to the resurrection of Jesus at one level, and of course the saints at another level? So that's kind of what they're thinking. What's happening to his body? Does that make sense?
It does, and I kind of want to go down that direction a little bit, but maybe let me just back it up and first ask,
Sure.
what got you interested in this topic, and why did you feel the need to address it?
I think what I was really interested in is the connection between what most people think of as the speculative scholastic literature, usually articulated in summae, sentences, commentaries, quodlibettal questions, disputed questions, and scriptural exegesis. I mean, if you look at any of these authors, even Thomas Aquinas, whose works haven't all been critically edited yet after over 100 years. What's interesting is at the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century, so much of what was edited was more philosophical material, more theological material, and scriptural exegesis was kind of bypassed. That wasn't really considered all that important. And there are reasons, especially with respect to the history of modernism in the late 19th century, early 20th centuries. There are reasons why focusing on philosophical texts, editing and retrieving philosophical texts made a lot of sense. But I was interested in trying to understand more about the thought world in which these authors were living. And it seemed to me that one of the best ways of doing that was by retrieving their scriptural exegesis. And there's probably no better event in Jesus's life, at least with respect to his public ministry, for bringing together the synthetic material and the exegetical material in Christ's transfiguration, because you get Trinity, you get hypostatic union, you get one person, two natures, communicatio idiomatum, you get any number of ways of dividing the text, which was something that in the 13th century people started doing with greater and greater sophistication. Just for example, on the issue of scriptural exegesis and methodology, if you look at Hugh of Saint-Cher and John of La Rochelle, for the most part, when they divide up chapters, it's usually like they might say, okay, well, chapter 17 of the Gospel of Matthew has 5 parts, 6 parts, something like that. You get to Bonaventure and Aquinas, and you're getting, okay, well, there are 3 parts, and the first part has 3 parts, and the first part of the first part has 2 parts, and it's much more sophisticated. And that's only in the space of about 20 years, maybe even less. So I thought that was really fascinating. And so there are a lot of really interesting things going on in the 13th century and 13th century theology in general. And it seemed to me that the Transfiguration, that event of Jesus' life, was a way of tapping into that in a way that, as far as I know, hadn't really been done before at that level.
It's interesting that we're focusing on this around the same time that Palamas was. I mean, kind of,
It is.
It's very interesting.
It is, because if you read Scotus, like as I mentioned, the 1225 to 1275 window, if you look at scholastic theology after 1275 in general, you read Scotus, William of Ockham, Peter Oriel, Nicholas of Lyra. I mean, at least with respect to their synthetic works, it kind of goes back to the 12th century model of incarnation, passion, death, and resurrection. And they don't really spend a whole lot of time talking about the events of Jesus's life. So there is some sense in which it is kind of an interesting parallel, even if Palamas was a little bit later in a completely different historical context.
Right. Yeah. Now, kind of bringing it back to what you were talking about earlier, if you don't maybe mind me asking, what exactly is happening, if you will, to his body? You said the light is essentially pertaining to what's going on with his body. What is going on?
Right. So scholastic theologians in the 13th century, and not in the 12th century, by the way. So really in the 13th century, they start asking about Christ's claritas. It can be translated, the word claritas, C-L-A-R-I-T-A-S, it can be translated a lot of different ways. I've seen people make different arguments for how it should be translated. Could it be clarity, just as a cognate, or splendor, or glory? I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages of all of those, and no one word gets at it. Clarity, as it's understood by scholastic theologians, is generally a quality of resurrected bodies by which they radiate light, physical light. Okay, so Matthew 13 says that God's saints will shine like the sun. They take that fairly literally. The human bodies in the afterlife, those that are glorified, will shine like the sun. So what they think of claritas is something that's going to be happening in the resurrection, and therefore they wonder, well, is what's going on with Jesus during the transfiguration, is that a kind of proof of the resurrection? In fact, like in John of La Rochelle and Albert the Great, for example, they deal with the transfiguration within the literary context of proofs of the resurrection. So it's very interesting how when they discuss the transfiguration, it's already after they've talked about Christ's passion and death, which seems a little strange. But they connect it to the resurrection really quickly, which is another reason why Aquinas's treatment of it in the third part of the Summa is actually fairly unique, by kind of pushing it back within the context of the gospel narratives to be something that occurs right before Thomas Aquinas treats passion and death. So I think,
Now,
yeah, go ahead.
oh no, so keep going.
I was going to say, so as far as what the questions are about, it's really about what kind of physical light is Jesus radiating, and if it really is the clarity of glory, then it creates some theological problems. Like if he really has a glorified body, then he can't die, and that's a big problem. So how can Christ have something that's characteristic of glorified bodies while still having the ability to die on the cross for our sins? And so that becomes one of the theological problems, is saying, yes, he had this one aspect of resurrected bodies, but he didn't have other aspects of resurrected bodies. And that becomes one of their concerns, is we want to say Christ was unique in this way, and he wasn't like other people. So even other people like Moses, who radiated light after he saw God, that's different. When Moses radiated light, it was because that source of light came from without. It came from his vision of God, his talking with God. Christ's radiating light comes from within because he's God. What's interesting about the way Aquinas deals with it, though, is that it's not just that it comes from his divinity, which of course it does. What's interesting about Aquinas is that, and he's other than Garrick of St. Quentin, another earlier Dominican, Thomas Aquinas really is the only person who tries to show that the glory, the clarity of Christ's body is something that derived from his soul also. So it's not as though it's just a divinity body issue. It's a divinity soul body issue, if I can put it that way. So what's interesting about that is it takes into consideration beatific vision, which not everybody does. Not everybody takes beatific vision into consideration when thinking about Christ's transfiguration. But it's not just that the divinity then kind of filled out or kind of radiated through Jesus's human body like a lampshade. Actually, Albert the Great kind of uses that analogy. It's kind of like a lampshade. Well, yes, sort of, but it's only because of Christ's beatific vision that he had from the first moment of his conception. So there's a sense in which what's interesting in the way that Thomas Aquinas deals with it is that this occurs, Thomas's question deals with it in the context of a miracle. So to what extent is transfiguration a miracle? And it's kind of like a twofold miracle. The first is that in a normal incarnation, if I can put it that way, the glory of divinity, which overflows into the soul, which then should overflow into the body, right? So Christ should always be radiating physical light with that model, always. So the only reason why Christ does not radiate light from the first moment of his conception is through what Thomas calls a divine dispensation, which he's getting from John of Damascus on that. So the first miracle is really the shutting off of, if you can think of it like a circuit, he kind of shuts off the divinity overflowing into his body, but it's still going into his soul because of beatific vision. So then what happens at the Transfiguration is that circuit is reopened just for a moment. It's just reopened for a moment, and that what normally would be naturally occurring glory in his body is then revealed to those who can see it. And then it's shut off again. So there's like a twofold miracle. The first is that it's shut off in the first place. And then secondly, that through another dimension of the divine dispensation that Jesus sees fit to show his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, he sees fit to show them his divinity manifested in this. Can you consider it a sacrament? The sacrament of his body? But the physical light, the claritas, then becomes a kind of sacrament or a physical manifestation of the divine glory.
That shutting off there that you referenced kind of reminds me of Philippians 2, where he takes on the form of a servant.
Yes.
It's still there. The divinity is still there. It's just he takes on the form of a servant, and it's hidden, if you will. You know, when you talk about here about claritas in reference to the saints in glory, is this somehow connected to Adam and Eve and their robes of light, if you will?
The medieval theologians will use the phrase stola to kind of talk about the body and how it can have peculiar qualities, what to us would be peculiar qualities. But at least within the context of discussions of transfiguration, they tend not to talk about Adam and Eve. They will talk about the saints. For example, the garments that are, that are dazzling white. Well, that's a symbol of our good deeds or actions, or the saints, or the mystical body of Christ. And you'll see that in the Byzantine and Greek homilies as well. So that's not that different. But they tend not to talk about Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
And they tend, for the most part, they will talk about how Jesus can assume different kinds of humanity, different qualities of humanity from different states or stages in salvation history. So, for example, this is really interesting, I think. If you read Peter Lombard's sentences, he says nothing about Christ's transfiguration. He doesn't say anything really about the events of Christ's life. So when you look at sentences commentaries, you wouldn't expect to see anything about the transfiguration or anything about the events of Christ's life, right? Because there would be no textual basis for it. But in Aquinas, you do. Actually, he does talk about the transfiguration in the section where he talks about what are called co-assumed defects. In other words, Christ assumed a humanity, or he assumed humanity, but it's not like everybody's humanity. It had certain qualities that are different from how other people have humanity. And so Christ assumed what come up in the early 13th century as defects. In fact, sometimes the phrase is co-assumed defects, a phrase that you won't see in the 12th century. You start seeing it in the 13th century. Not that people before the 13th century didn't think that Christ didn't have the ability to die or something like that. Of course they did. But they didn't have that, they didn't use that language. So the idea is that when Christ assumed his human nature, it was a human nature with certain kinds of modifications that would allow him to pursue his goal in becoming flesh and dwelling among us, which principle of which was to die for our sins and rise from the dead. So yes, Thomas Aquinas will talk about Christ's claritas within the context of co-assumed defects. Like, so did Christ have to assume passibility? And if he has clarity, then does he not have passibility? See, because in the Middle Ages, at least in the 13th century, the resurrected bodies have 4 distinct qualities: agility, subtlety, clarity, and impassibility. So the concept of agility is to have unrestrained movement. Subtlety would be to pass through walls and things like that. Clarity would be to radiate light, impassibility, and ability to die. And so all resurrected bodies are going to have this. So then there are questions like, if Jesus has clarity, which is a quality of resurrected bodies, then why doesn't he have impassibility, which is another quality of resurrected bodies? And if he has impassibility, then he can't suffer and die. So does that make sense as far as framing what the problem was for them?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, great.
And I do have some more follow-up questions, but I want to pass it over to Eric first, have him ask you some questions and interact, and then William is also going to engage you after that.
Okay, great.
So yeah, I'll ask you some more questions on the tail end.
Okay.
Hey, thank you, Aaron, for coming on again. There was something I wanted to mention here. I was reading through St. John Chrysostom's commentary on the Gospel according to St. Matthew on the Mount of Transfiguration, and he seems to say that it's definitely the light of God in some sense, but he then contrasts it. He says that it's not the full radiance that we're going to get in the at the end of time, in the eschatological consummation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious, does Blessed Duns Scotus or St. Thomas Aquinas talk about how this is a prefigurement and not the fullness of the light that the saints will bask in when we're finally redeemed? Yes.
So the short answer is yes. Scotus, interestingly, as far as I know, he doesn't talk about transfiguration anywhere. I mean, maybe there's some passage, in all the redactions of his commentaries on Peter Lombard that I haven't seen, because I haven't seen all of it, but I've never seen him talk about transfiguration anywhere. Thomas, like many Eastern and Western authorities does talk about it as some kind of prefiguration. Prefiguration because Christ's body at the time of the transfiguration is not a resurrected body by definition. Okay, so it's not the same thing. Even if it looks similar, it's still not the same thing. It is a prefiguration, but the idea of a prefiguration that comes up in Eastern theology, Western theology, that's fairly typical. I do think, though, that your point about the light itself as being something that's kind of penultimate, it's not there yet. Actually, there's a very interesting, I think very beautiful sermon of Leo the Great, which talks about this, where it sounds like what you're mentioning, namely that the full reality that the light of the transfiguration is mediating can be seen only by those who are pure of heart, he says, in the next life. So it's even in this life, Christ can show us his divinity as much as he wants, but part of it, and this you can see this in Origin, kind of is based on our ability at the moment. And our ability at the moment, no matter how holy we are, is always going to be somewhat mitigated. I mean, even the Blessed Virgin, the Holy Theotokos, can still increase in her love, you know, and
Right.
and virtues. So as long as people are on the way, as long as they're pilgrims on this path, they can always keep on growing in some way. So yeah, as far as the transfiguration is being a kind of prefiguration of the glory of not only of Christ, Christ's body, but also the saints. That's pretty ubiquitous. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good comment there. You know, taking this back to the whole issue of what we read in Gregory Palamas and the Eastern Orthodox tradition on the light of Tabor, which they think that this is God manifesting himself so that we can perceive him in the flesh. You know, we can perceive him in the time space continuum, and you know, that's really that divinity and, you know, passibility conflict there, because God can't really be an object that is subject to matter and time and space, because those things are fixed as creatures. And so, you know, I know that the Eastern tradition has this essence and energies distinction, you know, where they actually, you know, the energies are not the essence in a very important way. But, you know, I was reading Father John Hardin, and, you know, he tried to explain how we would be able to participate in God. And this is such a mind-boggling question. I know the Catholic Church has never really dogmatized precisely, and I don't know if we could ever dogmatize precisely how man partakes in God. But one thing that he draws from in St. Thomas Aquinas is that there are two things that deity and human beings made in his image share, namely will and intellect. And so God has a will and intellect, and his image bearers have a will and intellect. And so because knowledge is the activity of the intellect, and love is the activity of the will, that's the mode of presence. You know, when St. Thomas Aquinas talks about the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, where the inhabitation, where God comes to inhabit a human being, he sees God coming in through the will and the intellect of the individual, and by the grace of intellect and will being kind of boosted up with sanctifying grace, that is what it means for God to dwell in a human being. In your reading of Aquinas, does that have anything to do with the light of the Transfiguration, where there's an intersection between beatific vision and the actual light itself?
Yes. I don't know if it's question. It might be question 2 of or Article 2 of question 45, third part of the Summa. I think it's Article 2, where there's the question about another question about clarity. The first two questions are kind of about clarity, and he does talk about. He gets interestingly when he says where the clarity is coming from. He says, and he cites John of Damascus, saying it comes from his divinity. Then he cites Augustine, saying it comes from his glorified soul. So it comes from both. Now, the only thing that he doesn't get into at that question, because I'm sure he planned on getting to it later, but he never finished it, is all of the qualities of, you know how I was talking about the gifts of glorified bodies? There are gifts of glorified souls. And vision is one of those gifts, but there is also fruition and comprehension. Comprehension corresponding to the memory, vision corresponding to the intellect, fruition corresponding to the will. So, yes, at least in question 45, he says Christ is experiencing beatific vision, but along with the vision is comprehension and fruition, which belongs to the will. So the reason why his flesh radiates light is because his soul is radiating light. Does that make sense? It's receiving light and it's radiating light. And the same thing is going to happen to the saints in heaven, because when they have beatific comprehension, vision, and enjoyment, that glory that they perceive through this unmediated participation, and of course that gets to the difference between Aquinas and Palamas on how you just the language of participation, and I think they're two vocabularies where participation means slightly different things, essence means slightly different things, how you talk about participation or comprehension means slightly different things, but I mean I think the way that the Western tradition gets around the trying to safeguard something about God's essence is to talk about participation with some kind of caveat, or comprehension with some kind of caveat. Can we comprehend God? Yes, but insofar as we're finite creatures, right? Even Christ's soul, even Christ's beatified soul is finite. And so does Christ's beatified soul comprehend God? Yes, but. I mean, so there are different levels of participation. I think that's the way Aquinas gets around the problem about participation. But the saints in heaven, they will have unmediated participation, and but it's through Christ, and that glory that they will experience in their souls will then radiate into and through their bodies. So, Palamas, for example, will say that what happens is that the disciples, they saw with their eyes Christ's divinity in, I think he uses the phrase, in his humanity. And I think that's just not strong enough really for the Western tradition. I think it's not strong enough just to say that the glory is in, that they see it in his humanity. No, it's like radiating through his humanity. And it takes a physical form. The physical light is not Christ's divinity, of course. And I think, and that's where the debate with Barlaam comes in, and that's where I think like the Cappadocian debates with Eunomius come in. I mean, I think there are these 4th and 14th century concerns about rationalism in Eastern theology, and because of these concerns about rationalism, they're very concerned in their own ways to kind of protect God's divinity. And I think Western tradition isn't having those debates in the same way, or if they are, like in 13th century university life. They are concerned about rationalism, but they deal with it in different ways.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. That's very keen. Just the very word participation itself, it already gets away from being too absolute, because if you take the first 4 letters, part, how do you participate in God if God doesn't have parts? The patristic tradition is unanimous that God is simple. I understand that that's interpreted in different ways, obviously, because it seems like the Orthodox have reasons to disagree with Aquinas. I'm coming from the position of Aquinas, but I'm trying to learn the Palamite teaching. As you could imagine, I just have certain barriers, and I think it's
Sure.
A lot of it has to do with the language and the way and the perspective of things. But just the very word, like I was saying, participation, God doesn't have parts. We have parts. So when we talk about participating in God, like having a part in Him, that's got to be immensely qualified. If we were to take, we could solve it by saying God has parts, and so that's how we participate in Him. But that's not a solution that's available to classical Christianity.
Right.
So I was really compelled by. There's one book out there. I'm not sure it really resolves the whole Palamite and the Thomistic conflict, but A.N. Williams wrote a book on it's called it's escaping me now. It's on the union of Palamas and Aquinas. I actually lost it when I moved from Florida to Wisconsin. I wish I still had it.
The ground of union?
The ground of union, that's right. And Williams looks at it from Aquinas' point of view, this issue of intellect and will getting boosted up with the grace of God, with the theological virtues, the divine virtue of love and of charity and the virtue of faith and of hope. These things elevate the human being as a creature can be, and that makes sense to me. Whereas I think Palamas, it has a doctrine which I think precedes Palamas, of course, but where there's this articulation in how God can participate in the human race or in creation altogether. So how He can be both transcended, completely beyond, and then at the same time immanent in and inhabiting all things. And so those are two different things. So it makes sense if you have a corresponding duality in God, the essence to correspond to transcendence, and then the energies or the operations to correspond to the immanence. But we still have to keep, in my understanding, we still have to keep the simplicity of God. So I do, like you said, yes, comprehension, but yes, participation, but, and it has to be fixed within the mode of the creature, which is why in the scholastic tradition, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, we say that grace, the miracle of sanctifying grace is an accident, but it's created. It's not uncreated.
Right.
And I know the Eastern tradition looks at this and says, what? You got a creature there is what saves us? No, it's a description about the mode of the creature coming into the life of God. And so since that has a beginning and that grows, it can't be never ending, never having a beginning without end. It is without end, but it's not an eternal reality that the creature always existed. So, but I appreciate that. I was always curious to see how the Transfiguration intersected with the physicality of the Transfiguration. And what you said there about the beatific vision where the soul is being enhanced and then the body as a result of that is showing forth the brightness of God's glory. I think that's satisfactory, but I don't have any more questions. So William, if you want to take it from there.
Sure. Thank you very much for that, Eric. And Aaron, you've been incredible. I've just been blown away hearing you all talk about all these issues. It's fantastic. You mentioned a little while ago that the physical light is not his divinity. And I think you said that his body would not have been the same as his resurrected body. Am I correct?
Yes, that's right.
I agree. Would you agree that maybe that is kind of fleshed out very clearly by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, where he does indicate to us that the bodily risen Christ, that his body has kind of undergone this kind of change, which we don't really know exactly the exact level of how, or exactly how his glorified body is. But don't you think Paul kind of does flesh that out? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think yes, but maybe not to everybody's satisfaction. since there are so many questions that remain unanswered. That's why, as much as we talk about this, I kind of go back to John Paul II's Rosarium Virginis Mariae, where he talks about this as a mystery, right? This is a mystery. So it's inexhaustible. So it's not like, if we just keep on debating this for another couple hours, we're going to figure it out, right? And it's not as though, if we just kind of compile all patristic, medieval, early modern literature, then, we're going to have all the answers necessarily. In fact, even after writing this book, there are a number of actually modern systematic questions that still occur to me. I still wonder about. But dealing with the difference between transfigured body and resurrected body, Aquinas, who's much more sophisticated on this than anybody else in the 13th century, deals with this in a couple of ways. And it's very interesting to see his own development of thought. In his Sentences commentary, which dates from the early 1250s, he deals with this by making in an habit distinction. Okay, he says, regarding this clarity, Christ had the clarity in act, but not as a habit. Because if he had it as a habit, that's what resurrected bodies are really going to have.
Right.
So he still has real clarity. It's real glorious clarity, but he doesn't have the habit of clarity, and that's why it's only a transfigured glory. That's how he gets around it there. So he's kind of satisfied with that, but then later on he seems to go in a different route where he kind of wants to talk about the miracle dimension of it and the grace part of it, and he kind of abandons the act habit distinction. I'm not really quite sure why, other than it may be that it's too insignificant of a distinction. If we're going to say it's the exact same thing, it's just it's one's act and one's habit, maybe that's not strong enough, because then how are we going to talk about Christ being crucified? So I mean, that's my only conjecture there as to why he abandoned that, but he didn't stick with that distinction in the Summa for whatever reason.
That's some fantastic insight there. To kind of really dig a little bit deeper into your book, I was very fascinated when you were talking about Moses and Elijah. I've always been very fascinated because you brought up a particular Greek word that I've studied quite often, skinos, where I've looked at its usage in the Deuterocanon, in the New Testament, and the Apostolic Fathers. From what I have gathered, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the number of times that I've looked at the usage of that, I've always found it to mean either a tent or a hut or somewhere where a physical person is going to abode. From what I've looked at, its usage in the apostolic era, I've studied it in the Patrologia in the first, I think, at least 12 volumes. I found the overwhelming usage of that to mean a place where physical people will abode. So that does bring me to a very interesting chapter in your book, early on in your book. And I think you know what I'm getting at. Moses and Elijah, what was that? A physical apparition? What was that? Can you touch upon that a little bit?
I can. I'm really glad you asked it, because when one thinks of the roughly 10 verses or so of the Transfiguration narratives in the Gospel, it's so easy to focus on just the light aspect of it. And actually, if you read, the Western Byzantine, they don't actually spend a whole lot of time talking about the light. Yep. They spend, as far as overall, the fathers are fairly balanced. They want to talk about the 6 days and the 8 days. They want to talk about going up on a mountain. They want to talk about Peter, James, and John. They want to talk about Moses and Elijah. They want to talk about the cloud. They want to talk about the words. And so in general, there's greater balance. I think than at least I'm not talking about Gregory Palamas himself, but the discussions after Gregory Palamas, which focus on light. I think we kind of forget that there are a lot of details, very rich details to this narrative that I think are lost when focusing on the differences between Western and Greek theology after Palamas. So to get to your point, yes, they spend a lot of time talking about, well, did they have name tags like at a convention center? Not that they asked that specific question, but how do they know that it was Moses and Elijah? wait a second. This is before the resurrection, so they can't be resurrected bodies, right? So are they even their bodies? Or are they just apparitions? Actually, John of La Rochelle seems to think that they kind of assumed kind of airy bodies. So they just had like souls that can manifest themselves the way that they could if they had a body. That's not Aquinas' route. Aquinas is much more bodily and Aristotelian.
Yeah,
okay, so
correct.
Moses and Elijah really had bodies. Their souls took by divine dispensation material that allowed them to appear in a particular way, but they weren't, but that those bodies and that material, those were not their bodies. Because otherwise they would be resurrected. Or, there is a distinction between resuscitation and resurrection, like at the time when Jesus died and the dead came out of their tombs. Those people came back to life only to die again. Maybe Moses and Elijah did that, but the problem there is, where are Moses's and Elijah's remains?
Yeah.
Are they all together, or do you need divine power to put their dust all together, or how's that going to work? So Aquinas just kind of gets rid of the whole thing and says, look, by divine dispensation, God allowed their souls to assume bodies that were not their own for the purposes of communicating, just the way angels do. Angels assume bodies that are not their own for the purposes of communicating. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to communicate easily with human beings unless it were simply by impulses of thought, or which you wouldn't know for sure come from angels.
Yeah.
So that's how they deal. That tends to be how they deal with the Moses Elijah question. And then how did they know that they were Moses and Elijah? There must have been something about their appearance. The Old Testament does give vague details about their appearances, and obviously the Jewish tradition must have communicated orally or in some way, probably more robust details about their possible appearance. So that's kind of how they deal with the Moses and Elijah question. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that.
I think your answer was fantastic. It's a great answer, because from what I've gathered, the way Aquinas deals with it, to me, from what I've looked at, harkens to the early patristic testimony as well, from what I have looked at, the earliest as well. And I really, really appreciate that answer. I think it was fantastic. And I think the very usage of that word skenos, sometimes people don't realize that the way that term was utilized in the biblical text, in the Greek, does have something very important to it behind it. And I think it's very important that you point out that Aquinas was able to deal with that in a very logical fashion. You also bring up another area in your book, which I'm totally fascinated by, where it's connected with the Transfiguration, where we read, "And some shall not taste death." I wonder, have you looked at because we have a ton of patristic testimony on that. What are your thoughts? And the reason I bring that up is because I frequently have this brought up in dialogue with skeptics or with atheists that will say the Transfiguration was not a historic event, because if you read the surrounding text that you can find in the synoptics, you look in Matthew 16, 27 to 28, you look in Luke, you look anywhere, you will find the statement being made of the fact that some shall not taste death. So they say, look, they got that completely wrong. It's just completely ridiculous. Are some people still alive to this day? What's going on? What is your take on the statements that are being made there?
Yeah, I know this is going to seem bewildering, especially from a historical critical perspective. I know, for example, if you read the 18th century philologist Samuel Reimarus, his basic contention is that Jesus was like a kind of proto-capitalist who wanted to get free food and handouts, and he just kind of his kind of goal was political, overthrow of the Roman Empire, and he just failed. And one of the reasons why you can know that is because the kingdom of God never came. So to go into your point about the kingdom of God, well, yeah. I mean, it's pretty unanimous in the early church fathers. And you definitely see this if you read all the sermons and homilies in Father Daly's Light on the Mountain in the Greek tradition. The Transfiguration is the kingdom of God.
Yep.
That's the light on Mount Tabor is the kingdom of God. So yeah, it's I agree. Completely don't understand it, because and part of it's not their fault, because they're working with modern chapter divisions, which were invented in the Middle Ages, right? So I mean, part of it there is that there are chapter divisions that weren't there originally, and so maybe if there's stuff at the end of Mark 8 that goes into Mark 9, maybe they for their daily reading, if they do any daily reading, they stop at the end of Mark 8 and then start again at Mark 9. The classic example is Revelation 11 and 12 with the Ark of the Covenant, right?
Yeah.
The woman clothed with the sun. So I mean, yeah, if you read only to the end of the chapter and then start afresh, yeah, you might miss some things. But I mean, they're pretty unanimous that the light of the Transfiguration is the kingdom of God. So it's absolutely true. And especially if you go back to the discussion about the 6 days or the about 8 days in Luke. These have deep symbolic significance, going back to the 6 days of creation, and then the 8 days, which would be 8 stages of salvation history that are perfecting the resurrection. It's like the resurrection of all of humanity, which this is symbolizing. So there are definitely ways of getting around it, which aren't that problematic, actually. Now I can see why, if you're taking this from a historical critical perspective, and you're trying to imagine like what really happened, Rudolf Bultmann, for example, opined that the Transfiguration was really, just a kind of wild dream that Peter and the disciples had. Okay. I mean, that's an interesting hypothesis, but it doesn't explain very well, just at the level of history of religions, why this event became so important liturgically in the 7th century, and then it became elevated in the Byzantine period, eventually in the Western tradition. But it doesn't really explain, it doesn't have a whole lot of explanatory powers. I mean, I can't think of too many situations where somebody has a really vivid dream and then that becomes a major liturgical feast celebrated by 2 billion people. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Incredible points. I'll say something else and ask you maybe one more question, and then maybe I'll hop it on over to Michael so we can go to some chat questions. But
sure.
You bring up a great point there, because when I look at the Greek of Matthew 16:28, and you look at the parallelism of it, you can't deny it's hearkening to Daniel 7. You look at Daniel 7:13, talking about the coming of the Son of Man. You've got it right there. You have Basileia. You have the kingdom that he's talking about there. It's in every account. I've looked at it in Mark 9:1, Luke 9:27. So any way you look, it bears the exact same thing that you said. This is what the kingdom is referring to. And then when you look at it, you're correct about that. From what I've looked at, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I've yet to find a father that says otherwise. I looked at Theophylact. I looked at the great Ambrose, Gregory the Great, Leo the Great, Hilary of Poitiers, and all of the Aquinas as well. All of the ones that I have looked at say the exact same thing. So I think when we approach this the way modern day skeptics are doing, without looking at it from the lenses of the early church, I think that's the biggest problem that we encounter. And I'll just ask you one other question, and then maybe I'll hop it on over to Michael. But what are your thoughts on looking at this from a modern day perspective as opposed to using the lenses of the early church? Do you think it's a bit problematic? Because I've read statements made by some gentlemen such as Raymond Brown who take a very different approach than some of these ancient church fathers. And to me, I find that problematic, because when we look at the early fathers, we have what Aquinas would have called that golden chain, that unbroken chain of tradition, where they do interpret this in an almost unanimous fashion from the way I've looked at it.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I kind of go back to the idea of it as a mystery. So, starting with Christ's person and realizing that any event of Christ's life is going to be infinite, just because of who he is. Now, that's a different question from the historical critical approach, which the Catholic Church has validated. It's an important necessary method. I think one of the most clear articulations of the value, setting aside Divino Flante Spiritu, Dei Verbum, Second Vatican Council, is actually Benedict XVI's Jesus of Nazareth, where he talks about the boundaries of historical critical method and what it sheds light on. And what it sheds light on is history. And his point, which I think is really helpful, is as long as historical critical method helps us with history, that's totally great. The only problem is historical critical method often does not stay within the realm of history. often it kind of brings in a latent philosophy of history, a kind of latent philosophical presuppositions, which is why kind of Pius IX was skeptical of historical critical method at the end of the 19th century. So, but the problem is not the method per se. The problem is what kinds of philosophical presuppositions are being brought in. But I mean, I think as long as sacred scripture, as understood by the church, is read by the faith of the church, then these mysteries can be approached in any number of ways. And that's why, even though there are things like the unanimity regarding the kingdom of God, there are other things that are not so unanimous, like whether any physical light is being seen, which seems like Gregor Palamas's view, which, by the way, is not the tradition. So as much as Palamas might be held up as like the synthesizer, the synthesis of the Greek tradition, on that particular point, this kind of we would be silly to think that there's some kind of actual physical light going on. That's actually not very representative of the previous Latin and Greek tradition. That's actually pretty novel, actually.
I agree.
So it's not like whoever our hero is at whatever point is always going to be unanimous. And yet, can we bring Palamas's emphasis on the theotes, the energy, the divine energy of God, along with Aquinas's emphasis on claritas, which is sensible light? Yeah, I think we can bring that. I think those are compatible because it's the divinity that manifests itself through the physical light. I mean, to me, it's not that dissimilar. Maybe I'm being naively optimistic here. It's not that dissimilar to like the filioque issue. I mean, with the filioque issue, I mean, it's not as though the filioque or not filioque are mutually exclusive. As Congar has pointed out, East and West were in full communion with each other for, hundreds of years. And there were even Greek formulations of something approximating filioque. And it's just that the Greek has two words to talk about proceed, and Latin has one word. Well, to me, it's not dissimilar. Namely, Greek theologians, and especially if you connect this to John of Damascus, who's a big hero for Thomas Aquinas. John of Damascus wants to emphasize Christ's divinity as the source of this light. And I think for Aquinas, that's great. That's totally true. But Augustine says that it's mediated by his beatified soul. So can you have both the divinity and the mediation of the beatified soul, which you don't see in Greek homilies? You just don't see any. I can't recall a place where a Greek or patristic Greek or Byzantine author is saying this is mediated by Christ's soul. It's not that's not what they're interested in. They're not interested. They are interested in talking about the resurrection, but they're not interested in talking about beatific vision. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, no doubt. Oh yeah, no doubt.
I think it's not. There's no mutual incompatibility between the traditions, and I think it's not really a problem even with respect to historical critical method. It just depends on what the presuppositions of the historical critical methods are. In the first presupposition, question would have to be: are miracles possible? And obviously for most modern historical critical methods from the 18th century, miracles are impossible. If by miracle you mean suspension of the laws of nature, that's impossible. Well, okay. You can't really debate about that.
Right. Aaron, thank you for your answer. It was incredible. I want to hop in and over to Michael to see if we have any chat questions, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, and I have one more question before we get to the chat questions.
Sure.
Would you say that the Franciscan and Dominican perspective on this issue was later addressed by the Byzantine church, or was there just basically no interaction in the East with what was being taught here in the West?
Okay,
Can you hear me?
Does the Greek tradition is it incompatible?
Well, no. Does it interact with the Dominican and the Franciscan tradition? If so, what was their assessment of it?
Yeah, as far as the 14th century debates regarding hesychasm, no interaction at all, as far as I know.
None. Wow.
I mean,
okay.
there are 14th century Greek Orthodox theologians who like Thomas Aquinas. Marcus Plested has a book about Orthodox readings of Aquinas. As far as I know, there's nothing about Transfiguration, though.
And why do you think that is, that they weren't interacting with the Western tradition here?
Yeah,
Just
I
seems
don't.
odd that this would be. Now I understand that there's a schism by this point. I get it, but you would still think that there would be some kind of interaction taking place, or
Well, I know, Palamas did read Augustine,
yeah,
and Palamas did read Aquinas, but I'm not an expert on what things he
yeah,
read, and I know he read Aquinas, but he probably didn't read question 45 of the third part of the Summa, or if he did, he didn't really feel
right,
like he was required to comment on it.
yeah. That makes sense. This one is from Sean. He's asking, how can Christ's soul not fully comprehend God? Christ is God, so wouldn't he have full comprehension?
Okay, well, Christ is God in his divine nature. He comprehends everything fully, but his soul is part of his human nature, and his human nature is finite and created, and therefore, from that point of view, can't comprehend everything.
This one
Yeah,
is.
that's the ancient heresy, the Apollinarian heresy.
Yeah,
Thank God
you have to keep the two natures unmixed and unconfused.
right.
This one is from Kesug. On the created psychosomatic unity between the soul and body of each person, would not the bodily form appearance of Moses and Elijah not suggest that a soul is imprinted with its own body's image?
That seems to be the opinion of John of La Rochelle, who is inspired by a passage from Augustine. Augustine, and I forgot the work, he recounts a passage in which somehow people who died came back to life like ghosts or something and appeared to people, and they had a particular form. And so because of that, and there's no clear assumption of a physical body. So Augustine seems to think, or at least John of La Rochelle cites a passage of Augustine that seems to suggest that this is a kind of airy body. Actually, even you get this idea of an airy body in Hugh of St. Victor as well, that demons can take on airy bodies. That is, you couldn't actually touch them. You could see demons appear or the souls of the departed appear, but like if you reached out and to touch, like shake their hand or something, your hand would go through their body or something. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have to tell you. I mean, John of La Rochelle's idea seems to be that the soul of the body as a form, when it can't manifest itself just in any way, it's going to manifest itself in the way that it would when it's attached to or joined to its body. But Thomas Aquinas doesn't really understand the soul as form of the body in that way. Because if you understand the form of the body in that way, it's almost as though you're imagining the soul as a kind of ghost with its own body already. And so then you have a weird kind of, okay, well, if the soul already has some kind of form, even a phantasmic form, then doesn't it already have a body? And then what would be the difference when it actually has a physical body? So I think this is a difference between maybe a more Neoplatonic and an Aristotelian form. But yeah, like Aquinas doesn't think that the bodies are going to necessarily have to be joined to souls that way. It might just be an Aristotelian metaphysics issue.
This one is from Nazim. How does the light of the Transfiguration compare to the glory of the Lord on Mount Sinai?
Right. If by that you mean when Moses talked with God, then the difference is that Jesus's light came from within, and Moses's light, when he came down from the mountain and his face was so glorious he had to cover his face, otherwise he would be blinding the Israelites. He got that because it was an external source. That's the difference. So Moses, as a mere creature, has to have that kind of glory given to him from without. Christ, as God, the beatified soul, has the glory of the divinity overflow into the soul, overflows into the body, and so it comes from within himself.
I don't see any more chat questions, but I want to direct everybody's attention once again to Amazon.com. Professor Aaron Canty's book is titled Light and Glory, the Transfiguration of Christ in Early Franciscan and Dominican Theology, available there. Professor Canty, this was excellent and truly fascinating. I'd love to have you on the show again if you're willing.
Okay, great. Thank you for inviting me. Appreciated your questions and the invitation.
Absolutely. We enjoyed it. Gentlemen, William, Eric, thank y'all for coming on. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
Okay,
thanks
thank
for
you very
having
much. I
And
appreciate
everyone,
it.
thank you for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe, and share this on your social media. Until next time, God bless you all.